delighted that the two authors joined me too. Michael Lillis and Professor Ronan Fanning wrote the book on Eliza. Always the salesman.
Well, seeing as we have the book to display, let's talk about the book a little bit. I said in the introduction, which I felt from a lot of interviews that I'd read, that the book and the film were both labours of love, and they're almost romantic works. When you talk about Eliza, it's with a lot of respect for someone that you've never met before. Can you talk a bit about why you feel so much respect and responsibility to redress some of the things that have been said about her?
I first heard of Eliza Lynch in 1991. I still am in the aircraft leasing business, and I was working for an Irishman that many of you have heard of, those of you who are Irish at least, Tony Ryan, leasing an aircraft to the Paraguayan Air Force in Asuncion. On my first visit, I was signing a contract. The president of Paraguay sent for me. I didn't know what to expect. This was not on my agenda. And he told me he'd never met an Irishman. But he said, "What do they think in your country of our national heroine?" I was there with our lawyer who appears in this film, Esteban Burt. I looked at Esteban in frank confusion. And I said, "Your Excellency, it is a matter of the greatest interest." But when we walked out, I said to Esteban, "Who the hell is he talking about?" He said, "Oh, didn't you know our national heroine is an Irish woman, Eliza Lynch." That was the start. And then over the years, it became a sort of a hobby and a bit of an obsession. And Ronan Fanning, a serious historian, I'm not even a historian, joined forces and we collected a vast body of research. And after many disputes between us, we decided, as to what had happened. We had help from many people all over the world. Our researches were conducted in 8 countries. The most interesting place being the secret library of the Vatican, which was full of scandalous stuff about some of the parties. And we have both been accused of falling in love with Eliza Lynch. I don't think it would be very difficult to do that. But we have, I'm raised and educated as Catholic, and there is an exercise which is called, resisting impure thoughts. And I have been practicing, to the best of my ability, resistance. I don't think it applies in quite the same way to Ronan. But I certainly am what we in Ireland call a sneaking regarder.
Well, I'm not quite sure what doesn't apply in quite the same way to me. But I would say maybe it's the professional historian. I certainly don't think I ever fell in love with Eliza Lynch. But I would say that I do admire her capacity for survival. I mean, her story is an extraordinary story. And there's only Alan Giselnan's done an absolutely wonderful job. But the story here, I mean, when she came back in 1870, she took legal actions in London, she took legal actions in Edinburgh, that's referred to. I don't know whether any of you come from near Croydon, but there's a school in Croydon, St. Joseph's of Croydon, where her children were sent. Her 2 children, they didn't know a word of English. They spoke to each other in Guarani. And I often think what kind of an existence that must have been for them after their previous existence, which of course collapsed their lives as being So, I mean, one of the things I'm quoted as saying in the film is about how thin the safety net is between abject poverty and having something in the world. And there's no welfare state, there's no old age pension, there's nothing. You're on your own. And I think what Eliza did under those circumstances to survive is, in its own terms, it's an extraordinary story. She was tough, she was indomitable, but I don't necessarily think at the end her story is that romantic a story. It's a hard story. It's a story, as I see it, of survival against the odds.
Are you in love with Eliza Lynch, Alan?
Jemma, how could you possibly ask me that and me, a happy married man with my wife here tonight? No, I don't. I don't think I fell in love with her, but there is something. I mean, she was a woman who inspired great love in life, and does seem to that. I think the power of her story, the power of her spirit, is that she seems to inspire that love in many people in death, and particularly in Paraguay. You know, in Eliza Lynch. Yeah, I remember the first time I arrived in Paraguay, and the main avenue driving in from the airport is Avenue Eliza Lynch. You know, and you can't underestimate how important her story is, and the story of Mariscal Lopez. But no, I'm resisting her charm.
Well, I find it interesting that some of the things that you've said, some of the terms that you've used, because as a historian, as sometimes a documentary filmmaker, I think you said we decided what had happened to her, and I was reading an interview with you. I think that was it, with the Irish Times, where you'd said your 10 golden rules for documentary filmmaking, and one of them was not to put words in people's mouths. And how do you reconcile that with this film? Because it's not exactly documentary, it's not exactly drama. Can you talk a bit about that mixture and what you think you brought to that?
I mean, for me, it's an interesting mixture, of drama and documentary, which is a form that I've always resisted. I mean, somehow, maybe rightly so, I felt it didn't work. But when I read Ronan and Michael's extraordinary book, and it's an extraordinary tale, for any filmmaker, it's attractive. But at the end of the book, there's an appendix, which Ronan mentions in the film, which is this defense that Eliza wrote, a sort of fragment of autobiography that she wrote in Buenos Aires at the very end of her life, or towards the end of her life. And it was her trying to right the wrongs. And in a way, reading the book, it had really been uncovered, this fragment of autobiography. I was struck that this suddenly was Eliza speaking to me. That this was suddenly her voice speaking from the page, defending her life, which in a sense I think was what we were trying to do. And I felt immediately that the film had to start here, with her voice telling her story, the ghost of Eliza in a way speaking to us. And in a way that was the starting point. But the defense was fragmentary. It didn't cover the whole of her life. I thought it gave a sense of her spirit and her, a sort of defiant, majestic spirit that she had, even towards the end when she could have been broken. But I felt that was an insight into her character. But then I had to fictionalize, the pieces in between, so that she could narrate her own story. Now that's an artistic liberty. But I think any drama or any documentary, particularly in the realm of history, is a version of the truth. I hope we've tried as much as we can to be true to the spirit of it, certainly the spirit of Eliza, that resonates so much in Paraguay. But in the end, it's always a version, as Ronan and Michael's book is a version, and many other books.
I think what is really, for me, was really stunning was Maria's performance, and watching it, and I just watched it as a submission to the festival and didn't know very much about the filmmakers at the time, and in my head the film belongs to Maria in so many ways. Can you talk a little bit about the casting of that and what she brought to the character that you built of Eliza?
I mean, I think Maria's interesting because I've known her for a long time. I knew her as a kid. She used to sing in a band called the Hothouse Flowers. You know, she used to go to parties with me when I was kind of 18. So I always knew her from afar. And Maria primarily sees herself as a singer, even though she's had quite a stellar acting career. But it's funny, from the very start, her name emerged. Now, of course, as a director, you go in all directions and you think all sorts of different avenues. But in a way, somehow when I look back at it, you know, all roads were leading to her. I mean, she's a very, she's like Eliza. She's a woman of great power, self-possession, quite hard to know, you know, as an actress, quite challenging to work with in the best sense. You know, she's not saying, "Oh, Alan, darling, what would you like me to do?" You know, she's pushing, she's challenging, as I imagine Eliza would have done. And she's, as a person, I think if she was here, I'd say this. You know, she's quite reserved. She's quite a commanding presence. But what was very strange is that when we filmed the dramatic scenes with her in a castle in Ireland, you could suddenly see how much she'd invested in it. You know, and there was a real depth of emotion when she did some of those scenes. She was genuinely upset. So you had, on the one hand, this quite collected woman, this quite imposing actress, but then suddenly you saw that she had sort of, that Eliza's beauty and vulnerability and nobility had started to possess her, which I think in acting is always key. And I remember after the first night, we shot the scenes with Maria over 3 days. You know, it was quite a tight schedule, but I met her the second morning, and she said, "I couldn't sleep. I was just dreaming about Eliza, that Eliza had somehow," you know. And there is something, I mean, I know it's easy to slip into sentimentality and superstition when you make something like this, but there is something incredibly powerful about her spirit, you know, that when you're there, say at her, you know, her tomb in Asunción, you know, you can almost feel her presence.
If I could just add something very briefly to that. I was there for one of the 3 days, and I saw that, and there was a moment I remember when the hair started to stand up on the back of my neck, because I thought that's what it was like for Eliza when she was looking back over her life. And I think that's what she captures.
And was it emotional for you in terms of, was she as you pictured her to be? This person that you've spent...
Historians try not to do emotion.
I'm not a professional historian. And I have to say the answer to that question is overwhelmingly yes. I mean, I spent 18 years researching this project. It's been my hobby from the beginning. And I went through all sorts of evolutions in my view of the character of Eliza. Conclusion in the end is that, you know, she had been grossly caricatured, misrepresented, calumniated against. And, you know, one of the things I think that comes out in the film, and also from me in the book, is that effort to address the calumnies. When we were publishing the book in English in the first place, I suggested that the title should be Calumny. And I was told by our publisher, an Irish publisher, that the Catholicism had been so kind of lost among the Irish people that they no longer knew what the word calumny meant. The title of the Spanish version of the book, which is a bestseller, and of the Portuguese version, which is not a bestseller in Brazil, is Calumnia.
I'd like to open it out to the audience. Oh, yeah, this lady over here.
Sorry, yes,
You okay?
this is a fantastic film, so congratulations to you all. Very moving in many ways, and I must say I am Brazilian myself, and I'm thoroughly ashamed, of course, of the Paraguay War episode, because I can understand why perhaps the book would not be successful in Brazil, because simply in Brazil they still write in books of history, even though there are historians of course, more progressive, but we're still, learning about the Paraguayan War as being, the effort to eradicate and do away with the dictator. So it is appalling, actually. So I hope in some way also this kind of sort of production will begin to chip away at that kind of attitude. So it's a fantastic effort. I had one question as I was watching through the film. Again, the first time I ever heard about Paraguayan War was when I was growing up in Brazil during the military dictatorship. So it was all about Brazil being Brazilian and proud of Serbian nationalistic pride. So of course that meant that we had to abide by the official history of the war against Paraguay. But fortunately, in the 80s, part of that history began to be retold, and it actually exposed what seemed a fantastic kind of view, which was that maybe in many ways, Solano Lopez wasn't the dictator that we've learned through this history of the Triple Alliance, that there were British interests also that may have motivated this guy to do or propose at least the kinds of reform in society which weren't welcome because they would hurt British interests. So this is the version that this particular would put through. So in doing your research about, of course, Eliza, but of course how she relates, or her history, her personal history relates to the war, can you tell there's any grain of truth about, not the sanctified Solano also, but I mean, that this guy was not the dictator that the official history that we told?
I might just, before Michael answers that, I might just say that first of all, it's extraordinarily, even as an Irishman, it's a wonderful thing to hear you as a Brazilian acknowledge that.
Absolutely.
Because one of the things that that's felt so passionately in Paraguay, this country that was decimated by this war, that really, and in Ireland we know about the importance of national apologies and the importance of righting historical wrongs, as David Cameron recently did with Bloody Sunday, as Tony Blair did with the famine. The real urgent necessity of Brazilians to face up to the horror of that war. And so, it's very moving to hear you as a Brazilian acknowledge that, so I'll pass you on.
In the Portuguese translation of the book as published, and in the Spanish translation, we ask in an epilogue the Brazilian government and people to make an act of reconciliation based on the analogy of Ireland and Britain. As to the point about British possibly stratagems being behind this catastrophe, I guess the first part of my response as an Irish nationalist would be, I would be prepared to believe that without any difficulty. However, I don't actually think it's true. I would be very happy if it were, but I don't think it is. There was certainly an enormous British policy, commercial policy in Latin America at the time. Paraguay was isolated from the rest of Latin America for many years. But in fact, the British tried to resolve the conflict on a couple of times and actually came very close, which I'm almost sorry to mention, but it's a fact. But I leave it to the historian to correct me.
No, I wouldn't dream of it, because Michael knows far more about Spanish and Portuguese sources than I do. Just on the British side, though, I think one of the things that came out very clearly, because I did a research into the Foreign Office archives and the other archives in Kew, National Archives and the Scottish Archives. But from the archives in Kew, one of the things that comes out very clearly is the old business of sending a gunboat, that if you were British in the 19th century, you sent a gunboat. And Eliza has a gunboat in the harbour at Asuncion when she goes back in 1875. And she gives her possessions, her valuable papers she doesn't want to lose when she's fearful, she's warned her life is in danger. And it's the officers of that gunboat who get her out and who get her away. The other aspect in which her Britishness is important, and this ties in very much with her extraordinary ability to survive. At Seteracora, at the end, she, not literally, she doesn't wrap herself in the Union Jack, but she waves the Union Jack. And at that stage, you see, she insists not that she's Irish, which she was, because that's one of the things we had to establish her Irishness. People said she was Welsh, she was British. We established she was born in Ireland of Irish parents, beyond any doubt whatever. But there's no point telling the Brazilians in 1870 that you're Irish, because it's not worth a toss, quite frankly. But to say you're British, that mattered then, and she did that very effectively.
Would you say that she was the first of a tradition of strong female Latin American leaders? So you had, after you had Evita, you've got President Rousseff from Brazil now as well. Would you, any elaboration on that?
Well, it's an intriguing question, and we are constantly thinking about it. What she had, and which she shared with Evita, obviously, was that she had a special relationship with the poor of the country, and particularly the women. Amazingly strong in the case of Eliza. She was adored by the street sellers. And Paraguay was a very unusual country. Women were actually the providers of their families. And there's a huge amount of evidence for this. She actually partied with these people, danced with them in the street, arranged parties for them, which went on night after night, by the way, for, in one instance, 4 months. She was adored. And the evidence, again, was after the war, which had been one of the worst wars in the history, if you don't mind my saying so, historian of the world. 99, well, we say over 90%. The actual statistics are 99% of the men and boys. After the war, she comes back, and the widows and the mothers of these fallen men, absolutely hysterical with joy to greet her. So she has that in common with Evita. And as to whether, there's the president of Brazil, almost inevitably the next president of Chile, a woman who's having a repeat presidency. I've noticed over the past 30 years of my involvement in Latin America is that slowly, the horrors of the worst form of machismo are diminishing. And women are, I hope you agree, seriously respected today in a way which should have happened a long time ago.
I'm sorry, we have to leave it here.
Jemma, could I just
yes,
before we wrap up, I
please.
just want to say at the start I acknowledged Ambassador Solano Lopez, who I'm so delighted is here. Before we go, I'd just like to acknowledge another person, an Irishman who lives in Paraguay, who I think embodies in a real contemporary sense the spirit of Eliza Lynch. Quite simply, this film would not have happened without Conor McInroy, and we've grown to know and love him in the process of this film, so I just want to thank him tonight.
Thank you very much.